Welcome to Hacking Capitalism. My name is Todd Bonnewell. You can find out more about me at todd.bonnewell.com.
And my name is Joe Blankenship, and you can find out more about me at thejoeblankenship.com.
Thanks for joining me, Joe, for episode 8. It's been a good time.
My pleasure, man.
We are kicking into power and control here. So just a quick recap. Just a few days ago, we did our 7th episode, a new system, and that went well, and we are pushing right along here into power and control. So without further ado.
Just right into definitions. It's kind of good because, after discussing a new system in the last section, I think it's really crucial to visit the concepts that are going to be big influencers in establishing a new system. Traditionally, power and control, control is considered part of power, whether it's, soft power being exerted by, the economic or social influences, or whether it's hard power, as we see with like military type stuff. It's important to understand both from the political and the economic and the social aspects of these things, exactly how power as a concept and as a force will manifest itself via different types of controls. And I think when we're talking about hacking capitalism, it's very important to understand that controls come in both formal and informal forms, and possibly hybrid forms as well. I mean, with the internet and social media, you see a lot of hybridized type control forms. Say this, don't say this, or say this in a certain way that's politically correct or acceptable based on the systems that you're using. And when you're hacking, you have to be sensitive to those types of things that are going on. And if you want to circumnavigate those things, you have to know how they work first. And also a big part of the new system in terms of power and control is, this idea of ownership, not just in terms of resources, but also in terms of the means that we use to both appropriate the resources and distribute them. Those in today's world, in terms of this hyper globalist, neoliberal capitalism type mindset, privatization and individualism is always kind of the mode for ownership. But throughout history, there have been many other types of more public, common, collective type ownerships as well. But I think what we're talking about here in hacking capitalism is something that is more directed towards the individual taking an initiative to see for themselves what levels and scales of ownership they can actually achieve, based on the opposing forces of exploitation, subjugation, et cetera, which leads to the last part, which is kind of legitimacy. Who legitimates the types of power, the means of control, and the ownership over resources, ideas, both the tangible and intangible aspects of capital, both in the political sense in terms of what is actually being controlled by who, when, and where, and in terms of what's already been established legally in terms of legitimating certain aspects of ownership, certain aspects of control, certain aspects of power. And then there's also the much more, I would argue, in terms of, actual control and power, social legitimacy of certain acts, faux pas, taboos, and also the underlying cultural context can't be done in certain terms of certain power and control relationships. It becomes extremely critical at that point to be kind of sensitive to those scales of control in terms of, women, children, where they are economically, politically, legally in different parts of the world, because a lot of people don't have those even considerations. So, and I think that brings us right into discussing exactly who owns and what owns resources, And did you have anything to add to the definitions? I kind of skipped over. There's just so much stuff,
Yeah, it's a great start, and I think ownership really is kind of central to our talk here. We talk about power and control, but in a society where we highly regard ownership, property ownership, and protect that ownership, it's a big thing. And so the ownership becomes the power control piece that we kind of latch onto here. But in general, power and control can take different forms, as Joe was discussing in the definition. So no, Joe, those are great. I think we can jump right in.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, that's, it's critical to understand when you're talking about, people who own resources control them. And ownership is just a form of power. It's something that's been legally legitimized it's politically reinforced, and it's socially accepted. And we're talking about who currently owns resources and what resources they own. It's important to know, geographically, if you're in the northern hemisphere, chances are you have way more influence over not only what resources you own, but what forms you allow them to take. Whether you allow them to take, an immaterial form in terms of an exchange value, or whether you actually physically move these things around in terms of actual, like, oil, coal, real energy resources, or you're talking about human resources or whatever, you know, who owns them and what they own is increasingly becoming abstract, because when you abstract either a human or a resource or something like that, you know, it's easier to move those things around or to devalue them in order to make them easier to be placed inside of either a category or a quantification. And ultimately, that influences exactly what's critical to who based on when and where they are. It's not just this timeline of, as a country progresses, these things become more valuable, or because these people are here and not here, it's more valuable. It's a matter of, you know, who needs what, when, and why. And, and especially in capitalism, we have this idea of, just-in-time manufacturing, just-in-time supply, just-in-time this, which means that it puts an extreme amount of stress in a very small period of time on a specific place, using resources in a very specific way. And, whenever we're talking about owning resources, we're always talking about, how they're going to be, both, mentally and physically changing these resources into something that can be bought and sold and ultimately controlled inside larger systems of, commerce. And, when and where that happens, it's very important. But the thing that makes it important is exactly the who and why it's critical to them. And, when we're talking about corporations and things that are non-humans being given human rights and human accessibilities and human voice over certain resources, especially when it comes to the relationship between the natural world and human beings, it becomes extremely important to flesh out exactly what those systems are in terms of ownership, control, and power. So, and that's kind of my take on it. Like, it's, once again, this whole chapter could be a book by itself. So it's like it's really hard to encapsulate everything regarding power and control in just one chapter. But
Yeah, it is. It can be it can be a lot of information, and I think it can be I think it can be simplified, like we're attempting to do here, in calling out the power and control piece, but putting an ownership name to it. I think maybe adds some clarity, but also allows people to think, at a higher level about what we're talking about, to apply it to their situation.
mm-hmm.
So, those owning resources, some places I suppose ownership isn't even a thing. I mean, in the U.S. before, before Columbus allegedly, discovered America, the Indians thought of ownership as a crazy thing when the settlers came and attempted to bargain for property. It didn't make any sense to them, and I think there's a reason for that. So when we talk, this whole sharing economy really also brings in this idea of ownership to a different level. And I think they're trying to redefine sharing as renting my stuff for a fee instead of truly sharing. I was never told as a child that I was to get some kind of pittance for my sharing, of my toys. And I think that, it's just a crazy concept. It's a crazy thing that these corporations can do to completely rebrand a word like sharing and have it mean something completely different. So, so I think, when we talk about owning and who owns something, and really what we're talking about here is ownership as a whole. And if we talk about property ownership and what it means for somebody to have an idea and bring something to market, we're talking about the same thing, only that it can be done by the group, by the whole, by the people, and it doesn't have to be owned by individuals or corporations or any of these other figments of our imagination. We can own that, both the good and the bad, uh, as society, like we do everything else anyhow. We ultimately own it. We own the pollution. We own, all the issues that the corporations bring about. We bail them out. Of course, I'm speaking again with a Western perspective here, but
Mhm.
we end up owning everything because, when these people come and go and pass along to the other side, we're left with it. So, and
Mhm.
just like we will leave behind our mess to clean up, we're trying to do a better job of minimizing that impact and also cleaning up the mess that we've inherited. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and over time we've become increasingly good at accumulating the good stuff and displacing the bad stuff to places that we don't care about.
yeah,
And it's important to hear both sides of that story. And I think academically there's a bunch of those type of stories, about people being able to accumulate a bunch of wealth via ownership of either land or goods and services or intellectual property. And we see the other side of that coin, which is people being exposed to massive amounts of pollution, massive amounts of environmental degradation, stripping of their natural resources if they're oil or natural gas wealthy. We see that stuff being exported at cost, whereas by the time it hits other markets, it's worth extremely that much more.
yeah,
Especially if, in terms of oil, especially if they fall outside of OPEC, they really get the shaft. It's like
yeah,
well, no pun intended, but there. But I mean, that's the thing, is that there's in some places this idea of ownership doesn't exist. In a lot of places, increasingly almost everywhere it does. But it's really from a you know the USA type perspective of capitalist ownership. It's like you give us money, fiat credit, whatever, for a good or service, and then you own that. Or you get to use it under a certain set of legitimized circumstances.
yeah. And
And
the crazy thing to me is corporate ownership, right? Like it takes
yeah.
totally different meaning. I mean, you take personal ideas, intellectual property, and you transfer them to the corporation, and that corporation can live forever. And these are things that should not be.
Yeah.
And we, we we think that instead of going in and taking over these things, instead of redistribution of wealth, instead of these ideas, we can just
Mhm.
ignore the idea of corporate ownership and redistribute the assets that haven't been distributed. And um, we believe there's plenty there to those resources. There's plenty of those resources to talk about and to be had.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that brings us right into the attacking the weak link, because this really draws out that relationship between society, political entities inside of a certain boundary, and economic systems that they use, both in terms of the political entity and the social entity.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we talk about going the easiest path, going to the easiest path to recapture resources, we're really asking the question: can the social entities, can the cultures and subcultures and groups, social groups inside certain areas, can they leverage political power in order to regain that type of those resources, whether it's intellectual property or land resources or energy, or any kind of resource that they have, including their labor time. you know how can they go about doing that? Because economic entities, no matter where they are in the world, they generally prove that their bottom line is for profit and to exploit whatever they can in terms of resources, time, people, whatever, to optimize that mechanism of making money. And even the world of nonprofits, I mean, it's you see a lot of nonprofits getting in trouble because 50% or more of their donations go towards overhead, which is people's salaries or stuff like that, and people taking these massive wages. And I've heard both sides of the argument in terms of that, where if you want a high quality CEO that helps you expand and get more donations, you have to pay him a lot of money. But at the same time, it's like, well, if the nonprofit's not really doing that well, maybe does it need to exist, or can it be part of a bigger operation that already exists that can then diversify into that aspect? It's which obviously that sounds like a capitalist mechanism and a capitalist mode of thought, but at the same time, how can a nonprofit that is trying to organize social good go through an economic entity to get the resources it needs to then leverage against political entities? shouldn't there be a mechanism or a way for the social to go directly into the political? And I understand with authoritarian and autocratic regimes, stuff like that, it's extremely hard to do that. But it's foolhardy to say that you can go the other direction through an economic entity and try and get results for an autocrat or something like that. It's like you're really going against two the same type beasts. It's like one wants to exploit you for your profit and your time, stuff like that, and the other one wants to exploit you for your tax resources and your human potential. So it's like in terms of those autocratic or military regimes or whatever, you can't. It's a lose-lose situation for the social entity. So, and that's where the idea of data comes along. I mean, is there a way for a truly revolutionary type thing, not just a counter-revolutionary, but a revolutionary type mindset to evolve, to where if a person inside of an autocratic regime that has very little economic impact and has zero avenues inside of a political system to actually make change for the social, can they go from the local to a global system in which they can generate content for data resources that then can be used for receiving a certain type of value that they can use inside that local economy? Are we technologically and intellectually advanced enough to do that? And it's when talking about corporations, they waste resources. I mean, both in terms of the relationship between political entities and also the usage of social entities. They take value from a system and they hoard it. They're accumulators. That's the nature of the capitalist mode of production, is just accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. And then you try to move around that crisis as much as possible, because if you can't accumulate, that means that you can't produce. And if you can't produce, that means that you can't make profit. So in order to do that, they accumulate stuff, but in order to make sure that is profitable, they also have to limit types of innovation that, kind of counter that mode of thought. They're all for technological innovations that help increase production and therefore increase accumulation, and then obviously increase the amount of resources they can extract efficiently from other people without having to worry about political legalities or social obstructions, such as protests and the like. So, we're really talking about societies nowadays not only breaking a belief system that everything around them works the way it works and there's no other way, but then we have to also help them fight against both political and economic exploitation. So, is there a way to create a system that does all of those at the same time without having any kind of negative effect on the social? And I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's why what we talk about is, as the weak link, is data as a resource, going after data, because that's where, that's a resource that we don't need. That if we consider the fact that we're always giving off data off of ourselves,
Mhm.
then what we are is we're a constant source of a resource. And just like our labor value, our just living value has meaning. And when it's captured as data, then it can be bought and sold. And
Mhm.
so this is a resource that we believe that we can manipulate and forge a front at that point of data ownership, to say that we're giving the idea is to give people the power and control over their own data. And in doing so, we believe that's a point of attack where there's no permissions that have to be asked. There's no policies that need to be had. There's no legislation that needs to be overturned. There's nothing. It's a capitalistic idea that we're going to step into the market, we're going to compete, but the difference is we're not going to do it for ourselves. And that's where the hacking of capitalism comes in that example. So when we talk about where to attack first, this is just one of many places. I mean, we certainly can go the route of revolution and take back resources from those who are hoarding it, and set those resources free for the people, or take over a region and go back to the old ways of just taking what we want, and that's it, not being accountable to anybody. So we're trying to push progress here. We're trying to push evolution through revolution. So we're trying to do this peacefully, and we're
Mhm.
trying to pick the path that says, that we can see an out, we can see an end, we can see the idea that we can start capturing something that has value. And
Mhm.
through that educational process of showing people that their data has value, it's liberating. It's also an approach to freedom, and it's something that we believe that is worth our time, obviously. So I think that's attacking the weakest link is data.
Yeah, and you also brought up a really good point of clarification on the term of revolution, because when in this within this project capitalism, when we talk about revolutionary thought, we're talking about changing your mindsets. The revolution obviously starts in the mind first, and that's what we're really trying to promote, is this idea of just avoid belief structures that you currently are embedded in, and take a step into this new box of saying there have been proposed over the years many different types of systems that can actually help me and help my future generations progress in a more diverse, global, inclusive direction, and one that's not exploitative either politically, legally, economically, but something in which we as a larger society can say, this is the way that we want to go. I as an individual have this, and I can participate in this way, and then I can receive value based on that interaction, which is much better than what we have now, which is you either work by the rules and live by the rules, or you have to suffer the consequences, which are ultimately not that great for a lot of people. And I think in jumping to this next section, we're really jumping over a ton of stuff, because obviously we don't have the answers to how that change in mindset is going to occur. If we did, I'm pretty sure both of us would be, you know, arrested at currently, because we actually had a real solution. I mean, we know it's wrong, but if we actually had a real solution, we'd be in trouble, because that would be challenging billions, if not trillions, of dollars of power in places where they don't want to change that paradigm. So jumping way into the future, when we're talking about when we've progressed to the point where we have gotten rid of companies, we can then, when we talk about accepting their apologies and accepting, or not, never accepting the apologies, just their surrender, we're really talking about the fact that we want them to acknowledge that they've been wrong in what they've been doing, and accept a transition in which helps us gain that type of new system that we've been talking about before, through the hacking and through our enculturation, through this new educational form. We've been able to recapture those resources, been able to harness them for our public, common good, that collective good, for the individuals and for a larger society. And we were able to recapture that power dynamic that helped them cede that type of control that they have currently back to us. So when there are a few companies left, they're going to have to surrender back those resources. They're going to have to give us back, the physical property, the intellectual property, the objects and services that we've been depending on, and many times, critical resources, both in times of skilled human labor, artisanal labor, but also the machines and the mechanisms in society to help produce the environments in which these people, work. So, hopefully, when we're talking about, returning them all to the people, we're not just getting back these things, we're getting back our freedom. The individual, once they regain these resources, they then have the freedom, both as an individual and as a collective society, to say, this is what we need to do with them. Let's get some people that know what they're talking about, get them in here and actually use their knowledge, instead of just making a byline, to make real change in a positive direction. Something where we're, in our mindsets, we're thinking beyond our immediate needs of, like, oh, I need to go to work tomorrow to pay the bills and the mortgage so I don't go into debt or whatever. We can say, oh, well, okay, well, your house is already provided for, your kids' education is already provided for. So let's start working for that next generation as employees, and start building a world that they're going to need for their next generation. So as right now, under the current systems of economics and politics, we really have to just focus on tomorrow. The next 24 hours, we just have to survive that in whatever form, no matter where you are in the world. That's the time frame. very few cultures think two generations into the future and say we need to start building a world for them that they're going to be then building for their next two generations out. And that's the real revolution in our minds in terms of recapturing resources, redefining ownership, and actually finding a way to gain the individual and collective freedom to do that.
Yeah, and I think if we look at that point out in the future and we say, how do we get there, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
if we start looking backwards at what it might look like just before. You had mentioned, for example, getting to that point where the corporations are giving over the resources, because what else are they going to do? If for example, we will start again towards the end there where it's a little harder to control distribution of, let's say, oil or something like that. If we don't have, if our reason to have oil still exists in the future,
Mm-hmm.
but we have our own oil, then as a people, then what sense does it make to have a corporation sitting there still drilling for oil and
Yeah.
harvesting it for what? There's nobody's going to buy it. So for what? And so you get to the point, even as a corporation, where the people that do exist still in that corporation would have to say to themselves, what are we doing? This seems silly. I mean, there's no reason to keep doing this. And so if we look at that and we keep moving backwards from that, we see a point in there where, so how do we get companies to start doing this? And if we can't start with oil, we start with data. So we start with Uber or Craigslist or Facebook or eBay, and we say, let's replace one of these.
Mm-hmm.
And then we replace them. And now we're saying, okay, so you want Uber or the people's version of Uber, right? And this is even a little more present. Instead of working back, we've kind of jumped back to more now, and we're saying, okay, what is that going to look like? How do we do that? How do we operate that? And we have these social experiments that we have several attempts at giving data ownership back to the people. Now, the value of data is, I would say, is probably the biggest value on this planet, and it's not been proven so, but if we were to say gold, oil, and we can see what kind of market caps all of these natural resources have on them, I would venture a good guess that if you add up all the information technology companies that exist, we're probably far exceeding those of our natural resources, because these are direct representations of people. And that truly has value, to know where people are, what they're listening to, what they're watching, what they want, what they need. All these things are important.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important. So these other things, the natural resources that fulfill our wants and needs, are almost, the costs are almost irrelevant, because we need to be able to afford them. So when we look at these things and we say we're going to replace these corporations one at a time, it doesn't take many before we have created such a bankroll that we're just rolling out one after the next after the next. And as we replace these data-driven companies that are generating billions or trillions of dollars, then it becomes easy to start acquiring these other companies that have the production means that we require, or areas that we want to move into as a people. So, as we do that, I think, that kind of path of shooting for data first, but knowing where we're going, and knowing that it's not just an effort to, be the next Facebook, but more like Wikipedia. It's not
Yeah.
an end there. We have more that needs to be done.
Yeah.
And, I think that whole path overall it's years or decades. And I think, though, that the smaller parts of that are here and now type stuff.
Yeah.
We have Wikipedia as a great example of something that is not as transparent as we believe it could be, but something that models the idea of something that's owned by the people,
Mm-hmm.
that is funded by the people, and it's driven by the people. And while there's a corporation there, and they're a nonprofit or B Corp or something, they exist and do what they do to keep that moving. Now, we don't know a lot of what those things are, and that's what we have a problem with, in just saying, yeah, that's what we want. Well, we want that, but we want more, you know, more transparency, more openness,
Yeah.
more flexibility, and more of what everybody wants. If there's somebody that says, well, I want Wikipedia to be something different, let's make it that too. So we need to, do what we're doing, open the conversation up and figure out where we're going and how we're going to get there.
Yeah, and those are great points. I mean, like you said, data is representative of people, but when you further break that down and abstract it, you're really looking at fragments of knowledge and power, that relationship between knowledge and power. When you're looking at your data as an aggregate, it's really your representation of your knowledge via the power of that representation for other people. And a big part of this transition for this section is really not just the relationship between society and economics, but also the in order to get this to occur, you need to break the connections that currently exist between political entities and economic entities. Because I mean, as of right now, especially in our country, in the USA, most of our representatives spend at least 50% of their time, if not more, just of their time in office, looking for funding to run for office for the next term. In a lot of our foundational concepts is no taxation without representation in the USA, and I don't feel like 50% representation is very good. And globally, that's actually pretty good in terms of government representation. A lot of places around the world don't even have that. In fact, they have much less. So just imagine what would happen if governments, political entities were able to break that tie and that need for economic support representing the people.
Mm-hmm.
Then the people and the political entities would be a 2-against-1 pressure against the economic entities to cede that transition of not just data and other resources, but that full cohesive concept of knowledge power back to the collective people, to individuals, to their communities, to help them organize the way they see fit for the future, and to help them do that with everybody else in mind. That's the kind of power we're talking about. And that mental revolution, that mental mindset change has to be achieved over the current belief structures that we have in place, that money is this, credit's this, and those are the only ways to transfer value between people. We need to break that down.
Yep.
And yeah, I think that brings us into our last section in terms of respecting the employee as a possible inside man. I mean, because when we're talking about the employee, we're really talking about either individual or collective labor, and when we're talking about the inside man, we're really talking about the key thing that is driving these systems in terms of political power, economic power, whatever. It's people that are doing this, and it's also ultimately people that are going to end it. We're using systems to end systems of exploitation. That's the hack. We're trying to help people realize for themselves that they have been exploited, and to help them then go back to the system and go, hey, what can I change here to make the system actually work for me? And that's a very soft power way of going about it. That's going to help them transition, them and their families and their future generations, in a direction where all people are together. In this project, when we're talking about this project, this is a project that's for people by all people. It's not one of those things where it's just two dudes talking. We're not. I don't even consider myself an author of this project. I'm just one person that's adding content to something that will hopefully grow in the future. I know Todd and myself, we respect you as a person. You're not just an employee. You are what actually counts in the system. If you didn't work inside the system would collapse. Economies, corporations, capitalism in general, if you as a human being are not working or consuming or producing some kind of value, the system would cease to exist. I mean, a lot of these middleman jobs of finance and services that are directed towards promoting these type of mechanisms, they would just go away. They wouldn't have anything to do if humans weren't actually doing what they're currently doing.
Yeah, and we're trying to show you
Yeah.
where your power comes from, why
Mhm.
you have power, and how to not further abuse it. And I think the abuse comes from when somebody holds a position and holds that position for a period of time and believes that they have that right to have that position.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of the idea that, you know, if there's no other positions out there and there's not people working, and that's a drain on society and causes, poverty, and the effects of poverty are crime and poor
Mm-hmm.
education and all these things, then you have to understand that that's your responsibility for that power you've taken in the system. You've taken that power,
Mm-hmm.
and it's now, sure, taxes and social welfare and all those things, but that whole system is broken. And we see that all the time. It's not more taxes. It doesn't matter if we double the amount of taxes that go into those systems. It's not going to help. It's not going to solve the problem because the system still is what it is.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the employee as the inside man, we're reminding that person too that you have this responsibility, and don't forget, you are one of us. So for as long as you stay in that position, we've got your back. So when you're ready to exit and join us in this revolution, this evolution, that we're ready, that we've got you. So keep that in mind when you're on the inside. Keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, and talk about things that aren't right, and do so obviously carefully, but there's plenty of options out there for getting the word out when something doesn't seem right. So just keep that in mind, because it's an important thing. You have that power. It is your responsibility. It's not just a job that you can just say, well, I was just doing my job, my duty. We've heard too much of this throughout history. Anytime anybody falls back to saying, to blaming their actions on their duty or their job, it's always an atrocity that has just happened. And we're trying to minimize the impact of that stuff. We're trying to give people their freedom, and we're trying to open up the transparency to see these things, so that we don't have to rely on people and their motives to do the right thing.
Yeah, and even this medium that we're in right now. I mean, Todd and I both realize that the computers that we're using, some of the software that we're using, the software is proprietary, and that has been produced by people that have been largely underpaid for their services. We understand that the computers that we're using have been produced halfway around the world, in 12 different countries. The parts being produced in more than that, and that manufacturing processes, they use labor practices that are atrociously, they're terrible, they're almost unspeakable and indescribable. And it's our responsibility to not just acknowledge the way that in which people and things are exploited to produce the thing that I'm using right now to communicate how it's an injustice. It's my responsibility to take that next step and say, well, we need to really acknowledge this. We need to persistently keep it in everyday conversation, and then move towards something where those people at every step in that process that gave me the means to talk about this stuff online, that they get their fair share. They get their say inside of systems they own, and not just use for either a paycheck or a pittance of some kind of living standard, in an industrial zone that is uninhabitable by humans. That they get to own those means and modes of production, that they get their fair share of that process, and that they're ultimately the owners of those processes, along with me and with Todd and with everybody else that's reading this and listening to this. And we're all thinking towards the future and saying, okay, well, there's efficiencies here that we can control as the group, make this thing fair for everybody, make it good for the future, and make sure that we're not exploiting anybody along that process. And until we get to that point, we're really just going to keep on hammering these points across, because if we don't, then who is? Who's going to speak for them when they can't even watch the video that we're talking about them in?
Right. Yep. Awesome, Joe. Another episode in the books.
Yep. Well, I mean, yeah, we'll definitely expand on this chapter a lot more. I think and like I said, if you're listening right now and you have anything to say, please send Todd and I a note, make a comment in the book on GetBook. Visit our website, hackingcapitalism.com. Email us, talk to us. Please get involved, because this is the point in the book where we really want to bring in more opinions, more people. These ideas from halfway around the world. If you're in China and you speak some English, or I think Skype can translate some Chinese, I believe at this point. Come online. You can speak. We'll translate. We'll get your opinions in here, because they matter. Everything matters. So, absolutely. Reach out and please help us.
All right, Joe. Well, thanks again for your time, and we will see you in episode 9.
Yeah, no worries, man. Thanks.
Thanks for watching.